So thank you everybody for being here, joining us for the first session of the second semester of our Wednesday seminar series. We had a very interesting and successful run for the first half of the year. We would like to thank Dr. Athambile Masola for agreeing to kickstart this second half of our seminar series. For most of you who have joined us, Athambile doesn't need any introduction, but I'll just read out the bio she has provided. Nevertheless, Dr. Masola received her PhD from Rhodes University. Her dissertation was an exploration of Black women's life writing, with a particular focus on Noni Jabavu and Sisonke Simang's memoirs. Her primary research focuses on Black women's life writing and historiography. Her research is also informed by the early 20th century newspaper archive in South Africa, particularly written in isiXhosa. She is primarily concerned with the nature of erasure and ways in which multiple forms of reading a variety of texts can inform archival research. And her presentation for today is titled provisionally, I think, The Poetics of History, Reading History Between the Lines. I won't read the abstract out, and Athambile, over to you. So just a quick housekeeping. You have 35-40 minutes, 40 minutes at the most. So because we would like to have 20 minutes, at least 20 minutes of discussion. So I will give you a gentle reminder on the chat in the chat box around the 30th or 35th minute. But don't feel pressured by that. Looking forward to this.
Thanks, Anandarup, and hello to everybody. And thanks so much for coming today. So I'm going to read, and then at some point I'm going to share my some slides, and then at some point I'm also going to play a short clip. So this is very much a work in progress. It's provisional, and even the title, Poetics of History, Poetics for History, still in the making, but I'm trying to think through reading history between the lines. And so I'm going to start with some disclaimers. Is that I'm not doing this topic because it's Women's Month. I have a love-hate relationship with Women's Month, but I was always going to talk about women anyway. And it just so happened that I chose this date, which is in August. The second disclaimer is that I'd set out to look at 4 poets for those who saw the abstract. But in the presentation, I'm likely to only get to 2, maybe 3, and then the other 2 will have to be part of the longer chapter. So this is part of a longer conversation about, how to read history in one way. So this paper is part of a longer project of thinking about Black women's historiography from the 19th to the 20th century in the context of deliberate erasures and a fragmented archive. However, as you will see, Diana Ferris's work disrupts this a little. So I should say from about the 1600s to about the 1900s. This has been ongoing work for feminists on the continent and the diaspora. And what they have been able to achieve is remarkable, and yet it still feels like there's always more work to be done. This work can be characterized as Black feminist imagination, which Pumla Gola coins in her literary analysis of post-apartheid feminist poets. She borrows from Carol Boyce Davies, whose work demands, and I'm quoting here, a more expansive set of interactions at the level of critical voice. These are the same demands which can be made of history, which needs to make room for more voices in order to challenge some of the problems of historical discourses which exclude certain voices or create narrow or flattened representations of historical figures who are perceived to be marginal, which is to say a historical discourse that dehumanizes rather than humanizes figures who are not men and who are not white. So this paper began as an essay that was going to read Makosa Zanaqaba's poem, Tongues of Their Mothers, together with Maya Angelou's Our Grandmothers. But when I read the poem by Diana Ferris, Blutbanda, I thought about a different direction. As I'll try to show in this paper, these poems were written by poets who have an intimate relationship with the archive and have a long relationship with storytelling, which challenges the archive and the ways in which the archive needs to be consistently challenged in order to yield more stories and questions which help us make sense of history. So I thought it would be important maybe just to kind of provide broad brushstrokes about what I mean by, I guess, Black women's historiography, or how I locate that, but also more broadly, perhaps, African historiography. So when I was doing my PhD, I first read about Daisy Makiwane in Noni Jabavu's memoir, Drawn in Color, and I became aware of the gaps in the archive and the careless approach to Black women's stories in the archive. Without Noni Jabavu, there would be very little, if anything at all, about the pioneering journalist Daisy Makiwane. Without the Women Writing Africa series, there would be very little, if any, literary archive which evokes women writing from across the continent. The writings in this series go as far back as 15th century BCE and stretches over half the continent. Without Daughters of Africa and New Daughters of Africa, an anthology series by Margaret Busby, it seems to me that without the intentional feminist work which believes women's stories matter and that women have existed in complex ways in deep time, we would be left with an archive that believes women's names, stories don't matter. What is my understanding of the archive then is that there are institutional archives which for a long time privileged of the voices and stories of men. The people who have had access to those archives by and large have been men. History as a discipline in the global South is deeply connected with the colonial archive, which was created and I guess is continuously being recreated in the context of war and dispossession. However, this is happening within a longer context where archives were shared orally and were part of the fabric of life rather than removed from people. Archives were stories, songs, names, iziduko, which can be translated as family lineages, poetry, artwork, and beadwork, and amongst a list of many other things. These archives found different meaning in the matrilineal organization of families and communities rather than the patriarchal state which we have. Therefore, the archive we have is in fact complex and hybrid because the institutional archive is constantly rubbing up against an ancient archive, which is embodied and at times spiritual if we think of dreams as an archive. And at times this archive also exists in family kists, room dividers and drawers, as Dr. Kolega Shange has shown in her work, which borrows from Vangile Ganjo's poetry and Babalama Kokona's theorizing of Umakulu or Ugogo as a custodian of histories. Corinne Zeyman's work on the Anne Archive is also useful here. By Anne Archive, she is referring to the absence in the archive, which is to say an archive that privileges the voices of Black women exists, but sometimes it sits within the absence. The fragments which exist, but are often ignored. Sorry, I'm getting myself confused. So which is to say that an archive that privileges the voices of Black women exists, but sometimes it sits within the absence. And those fragments also exist. And they exist within a context where some of these stories and archives are ignored or deliberately erased and undermined because they have been created in a context that deliberately undermines women's stories. But at the same time, they are protected by other Black women who believe women's stories, who love Black women's personhood in the ways that Alice Walker talks about womanism. So in short, the archive is contexted, but it exists. It can also be infinite because it is buttressed by an imaginative feminist practice which believes Black women belong in the future. So this is to say that while history is about the conversations in the past, it is also about who gets to create the future. These challenges with the archive then that privileges the stories of men are in a context that also holds the absences of women and can be mirrored in conversation about how we imagine the deep past beyond the colonial interpretations of that deep past, which have been racist and sexist and based on ideas of dominance. And so to this idea of the poetics and historiography, in her work, Zeyman uses Greg Denning's work to make a case for the poetics of history. And I'm going to quote Dennings at length here, because I think it's quite useful and it helps frame some of these ideas, which is also to say that these ideas are part of an ongoing conversation. Poetics are not poetry, but the suggestion that they might be is left with the breath of the word. There is much life and living in history. Being a humanity is one of history's many graces. Poetics and poems are both concerned with the authenticity of experience rather than the credentials of the observer. In a poetic of histories, I mean to free our discourse on history from any claim or presumption by historians or anthropologists that by our expertise, we are directed to seeing history as having one form or another. The histories I write of are mainly a human characteristic, not a technique of inquiry. They are the vernacular of our cultural and social systems. We all make histories endlessly. It is our human condition to make histories. By poetic, in a poetic of histories, I simply try to discover the most generous way to describe a reflective discourse on all the hermeneutic dimensions of histories as cultural artifacts. Poetics are the relationship we have with the texts which suffuse our lives, end quote. So even while this is the case in terms of how Dennings thinks about the poetics and in relation to history, my starting point of using poetry is part of a longer path of getting to how poets engage with the poetics of history in the ways in which Denning offers. In the context of making sense of the archive and building the skills and the acumen for encountering the archive with a humanist ethic, poetics provides us with the opportunity to ask, what if? In Kevin Kwashi's work, in his engagement with poetics, I think is useful here, especially his book, Black Aliveness or A Poetics of Being, where he says, what I am naming as a poetic might properly be characterized by the ancient Greek term poiesis, the activity in which a person brings something into being that did not exist before, end quote. Bringing something into being that did not exist before is related to Black feminist imagination in the ways in which it demands more humanizing stories about Black women. And I'm using Black here as a signifier to incorporate the work and the stories of women categorized as African, Indian, and colored under apartheid taxonomies, as Barbara Boswell explains in her book, And Wrote My Story Anyway, Black South African Women's Novels as Feminism. However, I'm aware that this is also within a context that makes complex these identities, especially when we take into account slave, Khoi, and San ancestry. The connection between histories and poetics is an old one, which has recently had me asking questions about where are we looking when we are curating histories, and how do we make sense of the writings of Black women in particular? The poems I'll be discussing raise these questions because they give us new worlds to think about the past, or rather new words and new worlds to think about the past. The scholarship around historical figurations, interdisciplinarity, intratextuality is as old as epic poems and elegies. They raise questions about methodology, interpretation, theory, and the connections between history and cultural work, which is in conversation with history. It is the age-old question about the text, the context, and the writer. By taking seriously poetics in relation to historiography gives us room to think of a discursive history which is constantly in flux. And so I felt that a fitting example would be the work of Diana Ferris and Masola in particular. Imagine if, or rather what if, Diana Ferris had not written I've Come to Take You Home? Would Sarah Baartman have returned to South Africa? Ferris's poetry crystallizes the materiality of poetry. It has consequences. Poetry can impact space and time. This is the kind of poetics I am interested in. Makosa Zanaqaba's poetry in particular the poem Tongues of Their Mothers, is connected to her relationship with the archive in the process of writing Noni Jabavu's biography. When she began writing about Noni Jabavu, she shares that there was virtually nothing available about her, particularly on the internet. When Gcina Mhlophe wrote the foreword to Nokukhanya Lutuli's biography by Peter Rule, she too was contending with the silences around Nokukhanya Lutuli's story, whose story was eclipsed by her husband's prominence, the Chief Albert Lutuli. So what can poetry teach us about the past? How does poetry help us think about history? What if we looked to poetry to account for gaps and erasures in African women's historiography? Poetry has the ability to manipulate and stretch the possibilities of history within the context of Black women's historiography in particular. And I think Black women poets in particular demonstrate that ability. While I will discuss select poems, I'm not suggesting that a singular poem is an archive, but when we look at the collective of those poems, such as the examples that I've cited in the Women Writing Africa series, Daughters of Africa, New Daughters of Africa, Our Words, Our Worlds, Writing on Black South African Women Poets 2000 to 2018, edited by Masola Xaba, then we have an archive. What does that archive reveal? It's stating the obvious. Women curate and create and recreate history. It depends where we are looking. We can find the humanizing ways in which poets and writers who are not historians have rendered history. So when I began this paper, I then decided to let go of Maya Angelou's Our Grandmothers and continue with Masola Xaba's Tongues of Their Mothers. And I wanted to read it in conversation with Gcina Mhlophe's Praise to Our Mothers. Then I came across Diana Ferris's poem in the latest Imbiza Journal of African Writing, which has 4 of her Afrikaans poems: Kratoa, Bloedbande, Albi, Ruth First, 17 Augustus 1982. And then a friend sent me Betty Govendon's poem, which is inspired by the Autobiographies, Biographies, and Writing Lives agenda issue from 2014. As I said earlier, I don't think I'll have time to go through all of these poems, but what is striking in all these poems is the methodology of listing, which I'm going to share my screen now. So in Diana Ferris's poem, Bloedbande, she names 4 women: Kratoa Eva van Meerhof, Sarah Baartman, Ansela van der Kaap, and Winnie Mandela. In Tongues of Their Mothers, Masola Xaba lists 10 women. Yes, she lists 10 women. Sarah Baartman, Ngabayika Chama, together with her sisters Mawa and Mama, as well as Nandi, Cecilia Makiwane, Daisy Makiwane, Princess Makoko, Constance Zulu, Victoria Mxenge, and Nomvula Glen Rosenbata. In Gcina Mhlophe's Praise to Our Mothers, she lists 17 women: Lillian Ngoyi, Victoria Mxenge, Ruth First, Mamotsaledi, Masisulu, Winnie Mandela, Priscilla Jana, Fatima Meer, Beauty Mkhize, Mamphela Ramphele, Ellen Kuzwayo, Helen Joseph, Amina Kachalia, Sonia Banting, Thoko Ngoma, Florence Matomela, and Nokukhanya Lutuli. And then in Betty Govendon's poem, which I've just said untitled there because I still haven't heard from her what the title of the poem is, she lists 7 women: Princess Makoko, Nokutela Dube, Phyllis Naidu, Charlotte Manyamaxeke, Bessie Head, Phila Ndwandwe, Victoria Mxenge, and this kind of grouping or generalized gesture, Mothers of Freedom and Sisters of Freedom. Notice the repetitions of Sarah Baartman, Victoria Mxenge, and Winnie Mandela, and also notice the new names, and by that I mean perhaps the names that are unfamiliar. This form of listing is significant, as Brittany Cooper shows in her work about African-American women in the 19th and 20th century, whose names were also under threat of erasure. In her book, Beyond respectability, the intellectual thought of race women, Cooper tracks the work of early intellectuals, African-American women, and how they combated the onslaught of the great race men at the time who controlled the public discourse about racial uplift. And this is in the context of America. She writes about how the women used lists, used to write up lists with each other's names. And they used to publish these lists in sort of newsletters and in some of the newspapers. And she explains, and I'm quoting Cooper here at length, she says, these lists are not mere lists, but the women's own genealogies of Black women thinkers. I do not think of these lists as mere lists. Instead, the intentional calling of names created an intellectual genealogy of race women's work and was a practice of resistance against intellectual erasure. These lists situate Black women within a long lineage of prior women who have done similar kinds of work, and naming those women grants intellectual, political, and/or cultural legitimacy to the Black women speaking their names. Listing also refers in the fashion industry to an edge produced on a piece of fabric and applied to a seam to prevent it from unraveling. In similar fashion, Black women's long traditions of intellection constitute a critical edge without which the broader history of African-American knowledge production would unravel and come apart at the seams, end quote. So by invoking and listing names, poems prompt to look beyond the list and ask more questions. The usual being, why did I not know about these women? Why am I only hearing about these women now and not through history textbooks, for example? And so I begin with Diana Ferris's Bloedbande. I'm going to Afrikaans and try to paraphrase. Bloedbande. Ons is bloedbande. Ons onthou en ons vergeet dat ons behoort aan mekaar. Deur die bose kringloop het ons ingebou. As bloedbande, bouvallig die huis van ons familie. Stand sakke, maar bruisend die bloed in ons bande. Kritowe Eva Sarah Athambile van der Kaap en Winnie Mandela. Ons is bloedbande. Vele het buig, gebreek, maar gebreek. Ons is bloedbande. We are blood ties, and this is paraphrasing, I'm taking liberty. We are blood ties. Our memory is our forgetfulness, that we belong to each other. In the vicious cycle, we built a nation. That's the name. Oh, no, that's the stanza. We are blood ties. The house is shaky, or the shaky is the house. Wait, we are blood ties. Shaky is the house we have built. And by the house, I guess she's meaning the nation. Even while these blood ties continue to surge. And that's just broad brushstrokes. I'm still wrapping my head around it. I'm still asking for translations. And I didn't want to offer a translation in that sense, because I want to capture some of what is being captured in the imagery of the woman in particular, but also the image of the blood ties. So obviously I was struck by the title, Blood Ties, as well as the names of the women in the poem. Kritowe Eva van Meerhof, Sarah Baartman, Athambile van der Kaap, and Winnie Mandela. What connects these women? I'm obviously going to make assumptions, but by and large, Kritowe, Sarah Baartman, and Athambile van der Kaap are more obvious in the sense that they share an indigenous and slave ancestry. But what is interesting is why then read them together with Winnie Mandela. So in a conversation with Jolene Phillips, who was helping me with the translation and thinking through these ideas, she used the word martyrdom to describe what connects these women. The slave and the indigenous ancestry is being linked to the histories of Winnie Mandela, not only during apartheid, but in post-apartheid South Africa. And more interestingly is how all of these women used their voice in the complex historical moments that they found themselves. The ons, the we, changes throughout the poem, even while the poem is circular as it begins where it started. The names listed together echoes the line that ons behoort aan mekaar. As women, more broadly, but beneath all of this are also the questions of freedom and how women, these particular women, had to contend with this question of freedom and martyrdom on the other hand. More importantly, it is the names of women in relation to other women that is interesting here, rather than women in relation to men, which often results in women being inferior or marginal characters to a larger story, which privileges the stories of men in relation to men. The name which had me going down, which had me doing much of the work of what this poem, I think, prompts us to do, which is to go and find out more about these women, or how do we read the stories of these women? And so I chose Ancella van der Kaap. So when I began to search for her name, the entries which emerged were Ancella van der Kaap wine, which is from the Moratti farm in Stellenbosch. So I'm going to read what I found on the Stellenbosch, on this website of the Moratti farm. One of the slaves, a woman, was enslaved in the Cape's notorious castle. It's quite extensive. And here, the woman gave birth to a baby girl who was named Ancella. During those times, slaves born in the Cape were only given Christian names, followed by van die Kaap, Dutch for from the Cape. Ancella spent her infant years as a child slave in the vicinity of the Cape Castle, the Cape Gardens, and the market area of Green Market Square. Yet each evening, she and hundreds of other slave children and women were locked up in the notorious slave quarters. Having reached womanhood, Ancella fell in love with Laurens Kamfer, a dashing German soldier in service of the Dutch East India Company. They obviously had to keep their illicit love affair a secret and could not even afford to dream of getting married. Laurens had a deep love for the soil and had always dreamed of becoming a farmer. So when the Cape governor, Wilhelm Adriaan van der Stel, granted a farm to Laurens in 1685, he moved to this piece of land at the foot of the Simonsberg Mountains, some 40 kilometers from Cape Town and 6 kilometers from the town of Stellenbosch. While setting up his farming venture, Laurens was, however, committed to the love of his life. He would regularly set off on the 3-day trek by foot to visit Ancella in the Cape slave quarters. 3 children were born to Laurens and Ancella, and Laurens's one wish in life was to see his family set free from slavery and to bring them home. In 1699, Ancella was released after being baptized in the castle. Laurens came to collect her and their 3 children, Cornelius, Jacoba, and Agheneki, and to take them to their new home of Moratti. During her lifetime on Moratti, Ancella played a major role in building up the farm into a successful enterprise where the family spent the rest of their lives celebrating their freedom in the shadow of the Simonsberg Mountains. Today, Ancella van der Kaap, Moratti's multi-award-winning wine, pays tribute to one of the most remarkable stories and individuals in the history of South Africa's wine culture. And in another section of the website, it continues. The farm itself dates back to 1685, when it was granted by Governor Simon van der Stel, who was governor of the Cape of Good Hope at the time. This makes Moratti one of the oldest estates in South Africa, and along with that age comes many characters and truly fascinating stories. The Melk family has revived this rich heritage in an updated yet classical evolution of the brand, naming its range after many of these colorful characters. For example, the MCC bubbly is known as Lady Alice. She is joined by Ancella van der Kaap, blended red, George Paul Kunitz, the Pinot Noir, Ronnie Melk, the Shiraz, Alberta Anne-Marie, the Merlot, Laurens Kamfer, blended white, Isabella Chardonnay, Isabella the Chardonnay, and Ben Prince the Port. Now, I read this because I think it complicates or it adds another layer to the name that we simply see in Diana Ferris's poem. And of course, there is a much longer story here of slavery in particular. So in 2014, Diana Ferris and the Afrikaanse Taal Museum put on a production. And I'm going to read the blurb of the production, which I found in Afrikaans. And I'm going to read it in Afrikaans, which speaks to some of what is on the Marathi website. And it says, die produksie vertel die verhaal van 'n slawemeisie wat in die kasteel gebore is en in die Kaap groot geword het. Sy het die soldaat Laurens Kamfer in Kaapstad ontmoet en die twee het verlief geraak. Aangesien sy 'n slawen was, kon hulle nie trou nie, maar hulle het baie jare later wel geluk gevind. Die slawe het 'n belangrike rol gespeel op verskeie terreine, waaronder ons ekonomie, kultuur en erfenis. Hulle is wel op 1 December 1834 vrygestel, maar moes nog 4 jaar vir hul eienaars as ingeboektes of vakleerlinge werk. Hulle was dus eers op 1 December 1834 werklik vry. So it captures some of the questions of how slaves were freed and what that meant for Laurens Kamfer and Ansela van der Kaap. So I managed to also find snippets of Diana Ferris performing, and it's not quite clear if it's snippets of this production in particular, but her talking about this history, and she adds more to the story of how Ansela was conceived, where her mother was raped by one of the soldiers at the castle. And at a later stage, I'm hoping to interview Ferris further in order to ask how she came to the story and what archives she used to construct Ansela's story. Ferris's poem, The Story of the Wine Farm and the Production, are examples of the exchange between stories, the archive, and the ways in which they continue to live on in the form of names on wine bottles in particular. And if you go down the rabbit hole like I did, you'll find even more videos where this story is kind of recreated over and over again in videos where the owner of the wine estate retells the love story as he pays homage to Ansela van der Kaap during a wine tasting. Ferris's engagement with Ansela relates to Jolyn Phillips's latest work, Being Down. Okay, and that's the cover of her book, which is an epic poem, which is in response to a story she read on the back of a menu at a restaurant in Hermanus, Bintang Cave. Where on their website as well, they talk about this legend of Bintang. And so according to the restaurant, the restaurant is named after the last known Khoi strandloper to have lived in the Cape. She lived here at the turn of the 19th century and is said to have disappeared mysteriously. No one knows what happened to her. So Jolene Phillips's response to this legend or myth raises questions about the complexities of history and the responsibility it has to the historical figures we write about, particularly women. And so in this work, Jolene creates an epic or tries to create a story from this myth or this legend and tries to trouble this idea of how we can claim, or how the restaurant rather can claim this legend of Bintang as a tourist attraction. Whereas in fact, there's no clear sense of, and what does it mean to have the last Khoi strandloper? Who gets to decide who is the last of anything? And then it becomes this tourist attraction. So Phillips then creates a story in her epic poem in order to humanize the women, and possibly many women, but in this case, the figure of Bintang, who did live in the area of Hermanus, but are more than a story on the menu of a restaurant. It took a trip to the Netherlands where Jolene bought a beer, which happened to be called bintang, and discovered that this was in fact an Indonesian word, which means star. And in Tagalog, it means accusation. This work responds to a fragmented archive and myths and legends where indigenous people and slave narratives become stories told around the fire, as Jolene and I reflected. Now that there is an interest in women's stories, the over-reliance on the colonial archive does not necessarily mean they will be humanized. Ferris has, in fact, many historical poems which are trying to respond to this gap. Her other poems include Ons Kom Vandaan, My Naam is February, and Krotoa, which is a much longer poem, which also is a story of Krotoa's life in the way in which she's trying to put the pieces together as a way to respond to the gaps of the archive. In a sense, troubling the archive and keeping it accountable. This is what these poets and these poems are trying to do. And I haven't said much about Krotoa in this case because it hopefully will be part of the longer paper or chapter, which again can be read in relation to the film Krotoa, which was released a few years ago, and Corinne Zeeman's thesis also tries to engage with this. So I'm going to play the clip of Makhosazana Xaba reading her poem, Tongues of Their Mothers. Oh. Okay, when was that? Okay, oh, I don't have much time. Okay, maybe I won't read the poem, but I will read the last stanza of the poem maybe, just because of time. And I've already mentioned the woman that she mentions. And what's striking, of course, is the very first line of the poem is, I wish to write an epic poem about Sarah Baartman. And then it goes on. And then right at the end, she says, these are just some of the epic poems I wish to write about women of our world in the tongues of their mothers. I will present the women in forms that match their foundations using metaphors of moments that defined their beings and similes that flow through our seasons of eternity. But I am not yet ready to write these poems. So what Xaba does and what Mhlophe does and Govinden does, and I'm not going to get to the other two poems, is that they are doing more than just eulogizing women who are characterized as unsung heroes, but they are attempting to raise our consciousness beyond listing and by giving the names of these women stories. The form of the epic assumes that one has enough information to write an epic. In fact, it is a form which is reliant on an abundance of information. The irony, of course, is that in Xaba's poem and the historiography she presents is that she is still not ready to write these poems because more information is still needed. In Mhlophe's poem, she pluralizes many of the names of the women. And I'm just going to read one stanza just so you get a sense of what I mean. She says, do I begin with the ones who gave their lives so we others may live a better life? The Lillian Ngoyis, the Victoria Mxenges, the Ruth Firsts, or the ones who lost their men to Robben Island and their children to exile, but carried on fighting. The Matsoaledi's, the Masisulus, the Winnie Mandelas. And so this idea of making plural these women raises questions about if there are so many of these women, why are there so few stories about them? And given the hypervisibility of some of these women that she lists in her poem, some of them remain marginal, in spite of some who have even written about themselves, in the case of Fatima Mia, who has an extensive archive of her own writing and given her own work as well. And so given the hypervisibility of some of these women, they remain marginal and some only appear during Women's Month. But of course, there's a longer tradition of women who are writing about other women. I could have named Lebo Mashile Vangile Kanjo, who write poems about Winnie Mandela, Nandi Vundla, who writes about Esther Mahlangu. And what these poets are trying to do is to borrow from Lebo Mashile's poem, Tomorrow's Daughters, is in a sense, curl the straight edges of history. So I'm going to stop there. But of course, there are many, many ongoing questions that I have in terms of where this work goes. And I'm hoping the next part of this work will be to interview some of these poets and include a bit more of Jolene Phillips's work in the epic that she has written in terms of thinking about the process of recreation in a different form. And more importantly is to think about how do they go back to the archive and how do they engage the archive when they are reading with women in mind. But just to end maybe with a few questions. So if historians are custodians of histories, which is to say stories, what is their relationship with other storytellers like songwriters, poets, and healers, who are also in the process of recreating stories? Yeah, maybe I should stop there.
Thanks, Arthur. That's a fascinating paper. We have about 20 minutes time, so I won't really go into any logistical, detail about. Just put up your hand and ask questions and comments and make your comments, right? Maybe you can just, put on your video, or if you want, you can just put your hand up using the, the tool on Zoom, whatever you feel comfortable with. Shamil, please go ahead.
Sorry, I'll put on the video. Okay, sorry, I'm sitting in bad light here. Okay, that's better. Fine. Thank you so much, Athambile, and I hope the department played you the song "Welcome to Cape Town," or they will play you the song when you actually get here. It's not a poem; it's just a popular song from Cape Town. I don't know if you know it. Thank you so much. I enjoyed the paper. I just wanted to ask you a couple of things. The one is just to push you in a more historical direction as somebody who works with texts and manuscripts and so on. If number one, you find you can push these authors, some of them are still alive, or they have archives, to trace the actual writing of the poems. Are there, and is there an actual, because they are not performance poets. They do write out their poems. They do revise their poems. They do write drafts and circulate. And so I'm just wondering if it's possible as an historian to get that backstory to the materials, because you also need to contribute to the making of an archive, which is not metaphoric, but is actual in terms of real material traces, which is our challenge on the continent, to conserve and have these materials there. So that's number one, if it's possible. And number two, related to this, to say something more about them, because at the moment they're names. So Diana Ferris may be known in the Western Cape, but she won't be known in Mpumalanga. You need to tell us a bit more biographical detail, because I just think they're not simply voices. So yeah, you can't then do something that you are disavowing, that women have no history, they only write poetry. But they are they working class people? Are they middle class people? Are they mothers married? Their political involvements in the UDF or in the ANC. So you need to give them some more real substantial human existence. I don't find that there. And finally, the third one would be to therefore to bring some tension, because are you working within a nationalist narrative? These are poems, I mean, what can one, what are the tensions, whether it's competing narratives around the idea of the nation, party politics, some involved with the mass democratic movement or the ANC, etc. Others from in the labor movement, or nobody in the labor movement. So the question of women's poetry and nationalism. So those are three. I don't know if they too many at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamil. That's excellent comments and questions. Athambile, Mandisa has a question. She can't turn on her video, but please go ahead, Mandisa.
Okay, it actually articulates what Shamil was saying, but perhaps in a more contemporary kind of ethnographic sense. So I'm very interested by what you were saying about these elite Stellenbosch wine farms, you know, creating usable paths to market themselves around Black women's history. And I was also thinking you could thicken up your analysis a little by talking about the oppression of women farm workers and the fact and how they and whether they take up this past and heritage issues. I'm thinking here of an NGO called Women on Farms that you could perhaps be in touch with or articulate with their work. And then I'm also thinking about the politics of dispossession in Stellenbosch, particularly at Stellenbosch University, where there were forced removals. There's a lot of denialism about, you know, the racist history of the institution and the place. And I'm wondering the extent to which Psalms Delta might offer an alternative paradigm of actively gathering farm workers' oral histories as part of a project of redistribution of land ownership and profit. So I'm thinking that sort of that's something that I think could be very interesting for you. And I'm thinking the work of Kees van der Waal on some of these issues could be quite helpful.
Cool, thank you. Can I respond to those?
Yes, go ahead. We'll
Cool.
take another round after your responses. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Shamil, and thanks, Mandisa. Shamil, you're absolutely right. So I think what I wanted to do just for today, I mean, 30 minutes is such a long time and there's stuff that I just couldn't include, is that I wanted to start with the poems just to kind of show the different texts. But absolutely, their biographies are incredibly, incredibly important. And of course, I'm speaking about them as someone who's read their work, who knows their work. And obviously that was just not an assumption, but a kind of a pausing of their work right now, because when I speak about them, I know who I'm talking about, but definitely. And what you're pointing out is the story behind the story. That is the most interesting thing for me, right? So even while the broader project is also hopefully going to include life writing. And what I'm interested in is not so much how women, first of all, how the genre of life writing, autobiographies, memoirs, ends up in literary studies rather than perhaps historiography or history. And so what is the process of those women constructing their stories within a larger narrative? Definitely with the tensions, I think that's what this poem was, Bloedbande, not this poem in particular, but Bloedbande is trying to speak to, is this question of nationalism, right? Is that a lot of how we think about nationalism we want to remember only women who were in relation to certain organizations. We don't want to remember, in fact, until quite recently, even the stories of Sarah Bartman and Kretoa, and I know there was a webinar earlier this year and under the cover of darkness organized by, it's not ICA, it's the other institute here at UCT where Karine was involved with that, is that they were expanding on the names of these women who are involved. So what do we do with those stories who often fall out of the nationalist narrative because we only want to remember women in relation to the ANC or the 1956 moment or the 80s. And even then it's in certain pockets and not more broadly in thinking about or taking even seriously the slave narratives and the stories of indigenous people. So definitely, and I think for me, it's the invitation to keep going further and further back. And so that's definitely going to be featured there. And then with Mandisa, yes, definitely I need to thicken the analysis. I like the idea of women now. I mean, I'd be curious of who are the workers on a farm like Morati, and what do they say about the story of Ansela van der Kap, and how are they engaging with that history? And I think that image of the story on the website for me is quite closely related to then what happens with the Bintang cave, and how these usable pasts become these marketing tools rather than actual stories of actual people's lives and real dispossession that we are yet to engage. And yeah, I think the Sons Delta example, I think, is maybe part of a different tangent, but is definitely worth exploring. So thanks for that.
Great. Can we have another round of, we have about another 8 to 10 minutes. Questions, comments?
Hello.
Yes. Sorry, I can't see.
It's me.
Yes,
Sandy.
Sandy. Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
How are you doing? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you very much for that luminous presentation. One is constantly feeling privileged to be in this company. Thank you so much, Athambile. So tell me, I see that you also reference Black female poets in the main, but I know you've done other work before. I mean, in terms of prioritizing which ones and how you actually put them together. In other words, some kind of methodical, choice making that you can share with us. But also, I would imagine that you are not suggesting that women are entirely absent in the narratives that or if you use poetry, for instance, in the poetry that has emerged out of South Africa over the years, and possibly you're suggesting a certain degree of being deliberate on the part of the poets that you have identified and you're focusing on. For instance, a figure like Winnie Mandela has featured several times. Not just amongst women poets, but I'm not saying, of course, they've done justice to the subject and other subjects for that matter. So it's just a way for me to just understand how you make certain choices and appreciate the depth of the work that you've shared with us so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandile. Atha, would you like to respond to that? So we take another question.
Sure. I'm just looking at the comment, Smo and
yes, there's a comment,
but we
well.
can come back to that.
Yes.
Thanks, Botsandile. Yeah, so the method, I would say, is snowballing at this point. And as I tried to explain, the kind of the spine maybe of the presentation is Tongues of Their Mothers, because, for obvious reasons. Well, not obvious reasons, they're not obvious at all. I think it was the first poem that I saw using that kind of form of playing around with the epic, but in quite a short and compact way, but also being able to list all those women and what it's been able to do and how it's been taken up over time, because it was published in 2008, right? And there's been some time in terms of where we are right now. And so it was a snowballing. So for example, I'd never read Bloedbande, even though I know Diana Ferris's work, but it was when I read it in this, that then I made that connection. So it's kind of picking up along the way, but also realizing that these poets have been working with these poems for a very long time. So just because they've been published now doesn't mean that it hasn't been an ongoing process, which speaks to what Shamil was saying earlier. So the choices that I'm making, and then I included, initially when I started this, I wasn't going to include Bintang. And it was only when I spoke to Jolene, who's a friend of mine, I was like, hey, can you help me out with this? And then I had started watching her, or I'd come across her launch of Bintang. And it was only when we were starting to talk about this poem and the Krotoa one, which is much longer, which is also in here, that then I was like, oh, it makes sense for me to include her. In fact, and that's why I added the reflections of her. And obviously in a longer piece, I'll kind of reshape that in order to make that an official interview, I guess, in one way or another. So that's the method. It's purely conversational, but it's also understanding, I was constantly wanting to read these women in relation to others. And that's why I mentioned at the end that they are not the only ones. So there are examples of the Alice Walkers, Lebo Mashile. There's many. So it's a kind of genre. And maybe at some point I'll have to kind of name the genre or think about what to do with this genre. But it's really just as I'm exploring this area. So yeah, if there are more poems that I've missed, please let me know and I will happily include them.
We can have maybe a question, one final question. I'll just, please go ahead. Please go ahead. We have a question.
Hi, Athambile. I was just gonna, I think in relation to what Mandis has said, I think you probably want to pay attention to what Stellenbosch University is doing around Krotoa, actually, because I'm an alumni, and I think at one of the convocation meetings, actually, Krotoa came up and around this whole land issue and how now she's a seminal figure in the Afrikaner community. And so she is important now, but she wasn't in the past. And how even like Ansela van der Kap is also being pushed forward. And it's almost like a smoke and mirrors type of thing. And I suspect there's probably other poetry in Afrikaans around these figures written by white scholars or white writers. And it'd be interesting what their take is now, at least in the post-apartheid period around these women. Thank you.
I think there's another question. Please go ahead.
Sorry. I just want to pose a question from probably the same question from a completely different end. And I would play the devil's advocate here. And I would say that it is much too common to tease history out of poetry. The difficult task is to do the other way around, right? And to think about the incommensurability. And I'm struck by the emphasis on the proper names, right? Because in a certain kind of ethic of translation, what happens that the proper names somehow come across as indissoluble, right? That's something that everything else can be translated, but proper names cannot, right? And then they become somehow the anchors for specificity, for social, scientific, historical analysis. But I think what is dangerously beautiful in any historian reading poetry is, I'm thinking obviously the classic case here would be any analysis of, for example, Caesar's poetry, right? I mean, there are proper names strewn in all his big epics, but that doesn't really constitute the historical lexicon in Caesar, right? Anyone who would do that would certainly be misled. What he does to the syntax, what he does to the unfamiliarity of certain expressions, the cross-hatching of idioms, the willful misrecognition of time, etc. There are 1,000 ways, and you know this better than I do, poets play with, reject, and disfigure history, right? So my question would be that you mentioned Greg Denning, and I'm always very happy when someone reads Greg Denning. But some 20 years later, I think we also need to begin to start thinking about like, what kind of anti-poetics can we think to address this incommensurability, rather than finding the nice double entendre and poetics of history. And, it's a neat schema, and I love it. I teach it also, but I don't know whether it's a comment or a question. I'm just worried that historians will suck the incommensurable out of poetry. And as someone who happens to like both, I'm always worried that that would be a loss for both. So I would like to hear your ideas and comments on that.
Thank you. Two very challenging contributions. Thanks, Smoo. Yeah, the question of how and when people like Krotoa become seminal figures is something that we have to watch out for. I mean, when I watched that film, Krotoa, I was just so shattered, but I remember hearing that in some quarters, they were kind of hailing it as this really, really important moment. And there were lots of critiques even in that context. So I think it's about keeping institutions like Stellenbosch accountable to how they use those narratives. So even at the end of the film, they had this very weird kind of that fine print at the end of, some prominent Afrikaans families had descendants and their matriarchs are indigenous and formerly slave women. And I thought that was such a curious way of even framing that story. And in fact, that's possibly where the story actually begins or continues. So I think it's a very, very complex history that we need to watch carefully how, or be vigilant of how it is then used up or taken up, particularly by big institutions like wine farms and Stellenbosch University, as you're pointing out. So I will definitely look into that. Bodhi, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it's easy. The easy route that I thought I was going to take is, mining poems for history, and that's not what I'm doing. I think what I'm interested in is the ways, it's like the methodology, the process of how these poets, and maybe I'll stick to these, try and make sense of that process, right? Because I don't think they are writing a history in the sense that they are writing a history. They are engaging with the history. They are saying there are gaps and we don't know what to do with those gaps, but we're going to name those gaps, because I think for some time, history kind of lets us sit with the gaps, and that's how people fall through the cracks, or we don't honestly say, well, there are gaps here and this is how I'm making up for those gaps. So I think I'm interested in that engagements and not the neat schema. And if today I kind of presented neat schemas, because I was trying to kind of go through the whole story of how I end up here. And that's why the interviews with them in particular, and I mean, so Kosi is someone I know very well, and we're constantly talking about the archive. And in fact, it's possibly her fault that I even end up on this path, because she's very critical of the archive, which doesn't come up at all because I kind of did very broad brushstrokes. But and has helped me kind of think through how do we become more and more critical of history and how it's constructed. And I guess it's that constructedness of history, is that maybe poets actually make history far more messy because they are doing something that historians can't do maybe. And with the question of the names, I mean, exactly that. It's in this particular poem, Krotoa is Krotoa Eva van Merel. At times she's Eva, at times she's Krotoa. Even that kind of switching around and what that means and how do we engage with those names. Ansela could have had another name. In the clip that I mentioned, Diana Ferris talks about how her mother named her Ansela because of someone had encouraged her to name her Ansela. The woman the white woman who was working, or the Dutch woman rather, who was working in the kitchen had said, name her Ansela. We don't know who Ansela's mother was. And there's some speculation. So it's like all of those things is like, we want to write about these historical figures. Are we even giving them those names? So it's not in any way to kind of say this is going to be a neat history. It's, I guess, I'm asking myself about where do we complicate history and how these particular poets are complicating that.
Excellent. I'm happy to actually have another question if there is any. Otherwise, we will. I mean, we have. It's 2:06, so we are over time anyway. So we can have a little longer chat if you want. If there are any other questions, comments. I just had a short thing. You don't have to respond to it immediately. Maybe I also need to think about the question. question, but I'll just put it out there. And I really enjoyed because I was thinking of the poetics, and I was kind of grappling or trying to go back to my master's reading of Paul Ricoeur and how and that complicated text where he's talking about the epics or Greek tragedy as a certain particular genre which tries to embody action. And that's the idea. That's how it engages with time. It engages with time by actually trying to not represent time, but trying to represent action, because that's what happens in time. Now, it's been a while since I've read Ricoeur, and I was reminded of Ricoeur's usage of as if to kind of think of that action. So that's what he brings in to the poetics. That when you're writing, when in the Greek tragedy, one idea is as if, and you use the phrase what if. And I was quite interested in kind of trying to, at some point, this question of from as if to what if, and what is the nature of this particular genre, as you mentioned, probably have to name it at a moment, because as Shamil also mentioned, there are the material concerns of this particular kind of genre, whether it's nationalist, the biographical, because these people are not performance poets. It's what are they drawing on? What are they actually writing? So I was just curious about the kind of work that they do within the poetic work or the poetic labor, rather than immediately thinking about how they relate to history, but rather maybe within the work that they do, the relationship to time and history is probably hidden somewhere there. Anyway, if there are no other questions, thank you, Atha, for a wonderful beginning to our second semester. And thank you, everyone, for patiently listening, commenting, contributing. And we'll see you again soon. I'll upload the schedule very soon. And thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for helping me think out aloud with this particular paper. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Amanda.